87 Navy SEALs came through the doors of Cedar Vale General in a single hour, torn open by a blast that never reached the news. Every surgeon on that floor froze, every last one, except the night nurse they had spent 2 years treating like part of the furniture. When the hospital director screamed to know who had kept so many dying men alive long enough to reach a table, one answer dropped the room into silence: the quiet nurse. Nobody at Cedar Vale knew that Marin Vance had once answered to a different name in places that appear on no map, and the people who mocked her were about to learn that the nurse they had filed under forgettable had personally hauled all 87 of them back from the edge. Before we go further, take a second to tap like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. This is a story about the people we overlook, about quiet strength, and about the moment silence becomes the loudest thing in the room. Now, let me take you to the night it began. The tray was wrong, and Marin Vance was the only one who had said so out loud. She stood beside the supply column in Bay 4 at 4 in the morning, a stack of sealed gauze in her cold hands, while Warren Kessler read her incident note off a tablet, like it personally offended him. Kessler was the executive director of Cedar Vale General. He wore a slate gray suit at 4 in the morning, because he believed a suit was a kind of authority, and he had not set foot at a living bedside in more than 15 years. His shoes were louder than his voice. That was on purpose. Men like Kessler learned early that a room turns toward the person making the crispest sound. You flagged the emergency thoracotomy tray as incomplete, he said loud enough to reach the nurse's station, the triage desk, and the 2 residents pretending to chart near the med room. You understand that a flag like this triggers an automatic compliance review. You understand that a review makes this department look sloppy. It was incomplete, Marin said. She did not raise her voice. She almost never did. Her voice came out level and low, the kind of even that some people mistook for meekness, and a rare few recognized as something else entirely. Kessler smiled the way people smile when they have already decided how a conversation ends. And what exactly was missing, Nurse Vance? 2 rib spreaders, the sterile suction line, and the backup aortic clamp, she said. If a chest comes through those doors and we crack it, we open the tray, and we are already losing, a resident snorted. Dr. Adrian Coyle, chief of trauma, leaned against the counter with his arms folded and enjoyed the sound. Coyle was good with his hands and knew it, which made him worse than a man who was merely arrogant. He moved through the emergency department like a landlord, inspecting units he resented owning. She counts spreaders, now, Coyle said. Maybe we promote her to inventory. She gets jumpy around real trauma anyway. The residents laughed on cue. Kessler let it land because public laughter was a tool, and he liked his tools sharp. He stepped closer to Marin, close enough that she could smell coffee and expensive cologne, and he lowered his voice into the register menus when they want a private cruelty to have witnesses. You are here on a night contract, because we are short-staffed, he said. Not because you are special. So the next time you feel the urge to teach this hospital how to run itself, write it in the suggestion box and let the adults decide. Somewhere behind the curtain of Bay 6, an old man coughed wet and heavy. A monitor chimed. The ice machine down the hall dumped a load of cubes with a sound like distant gravel. Marin caught all of it without turning her head. She kept her right ear angled toward the room, the way she always did, because her left ear had stopped carrying the quiet sounds years ago in a place she did not discuss, and she had learned to read a floor by the sounds most people never noticed. She looked at Kessler. Her eyes were a pale, flat gray, the color of water, with no bottom you could see. I may have misread the inventory standard, she said. It cost her nothing to say it, and it saved everyone 20 minutes, and that was the only math that mattered to her at 4 in the morning. Kessler heard the surrender he wanted and did not hear the thing underneath it. He straightened his cuffs. Good, he said. Coyle put her in fast track, sprains and stomach flu. Keep her away from anything with a pulse worth mentioning. Then he walked off shoes, announcing him all the way to the elevator. Yolanda Reese found Marin a minute later at the med cart. Yolanda was the charge nurse, 51, 26 years on the floor, and tired in the specific way of a person who had learned to survive by not being noticed. She pretended to check a drawer. "You have to stop doing that," Yolanda said quietly. "Doing what?" "Being right in front of him. Being right is fine. Being right where Kessler can see it. That is how you end up off the schedule." She glanced toward the elevator. "Just keep your head down. 19 months you have been here, and you still make it hard on yourself." Marin lined the flush syringes up by expiration date without being asked. "Patients need nurses more than nurses need to be liked," she said. Yolanda huffed a laugh that had no humor in it. "That sounds like something they carve over a door." "It is just a sentence," Marin said. Theo Marsh rolled a restock cart up beside them before Yolanda could answer. Theo was 27, built like a college linebacker who had given up the sport for something kinder, and he chewed cinnamon gum like it had wronged him. He had a bad habit of talking when he was nervous, and Kessler made everyone nervous. "Director Daylight strikes again," Theo said under his breath. "You okay?" "I am working," Marin said. "That is not the same as okay." He unwrapped another stick of gum. "You know you let them talk to you like that. And one day, they forget you are a person." Marin picked up a bundle of pressure dressings. "Bay 8 needs a restock." "Already did it," Theo said, and then he grinned, because she had let one corner of her mouth move barely, and to Theo, that counted as a sunrise. "There she is," he said. "Proof of life." She almost told him to knock it off. Instead, she carried the dressings toward the far bay, where the old man from Bay 6 had been moved for a longer stay. His name was Dutch Halloway. He was 79, a retired Navy hospital corpsman admitted 2 days ago for a heart that had started skipping beats and a stubbornness that made him refuse a wheelchair. He was awake when Marin came in, watching the monitor above his bed like it was a card game he intended to win. "You run cold," he said, when she took his wrist to check his pulse. "Poor circulation," she said. He studied her hands, then her face the way a man studies a coin he suspects is not the year stamped on it. "Corpsmen ran cold too," he said. "The good ones. Cold hands, warm work. You ever serve, young lady?" "No," she said. Dutch let it go, but he did not look like he believed her. His eyes dropped to her belt, where a length of black webbing was looped through a belt hole and tucked flat, the kind of thing a busy nurse might carry and never think about. A tourniquet doubled, and ready tied off in a way that was not hospital standard. He had seen that loop before, a long time ago, on people who did not wear name tags. Marin finished her count, noted his rhythm, and stepped back before he could ask again. "Get some sleep, Mr. Halloway." "Dutch," he said. "And you did not answer me." "I answered you fine," she said, and she smiled the small smile that gave nothing away. And she left. Out at the desk, the ambulance radio crackled with a routine transport, then went quiet. Not dead. Quiet. Marin paused with a chart in her hand and turned her right ear toward the console without knowing she had done it. The dispatcher had stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. 3 seconds of static breathed through the speaker. Then a different voice came on, flatter and colder than any dispatcher, and the temperature in Marin Vance's chest began to drop toward a place she had spent years trying to forget. The cold voice on the radio lasted 4 seconds, and then it was gone. Marin stood very still and listened to the static that came after it. "Regional advisory," the flat voice had said, and then a string of clipped words that dispatch was never supposed to repeat over an open channel, and then nothing. She waited. The normal dispatcher came back on a moment later, sounding rattled, and told the floor to disregard a comms, cross a bad patch from the county relay, Apologies all around. A resident laughed and said the scanners always got weird before dawn. Yolanda made a note and moved on. The floor forgot it inside of a minute. Maren did not forget it. She filed it the way she filed everything in a cold and orderly place at the back of her mind, and she went to Fast Track because Coyle had told her to. Fast Track was where Cedar Vale sent the cases it considered beneath its dignity. Sprained wrists, sore throats, a teenager who had swallowed a fish hook on a dare. Coyle walked past the doorway twice in the first hour, just to make sure she saw him not needing her. The second time, he stopped. "You look bored, Vance," he said. "Good. Bored is where you belong." He tapped the frame with his ring, a habit that set her teeth on edge, because the sound was small and constant, and meant nothing. Trauma is for people who can hold their nerve. You flag trays and count spreaders. Stay in your lane and we will get along fine. I intend to, she said. He waited for more, for a flush, or a swallow, or some sign that he had reached her. He got a level gray stare and a face like still water, and it annoyed him more than defiance would have. He walked off, tapping his ring the whole way. The waiting room sat just past the Fast Track curtain, 40 plastic chairs, and a vending machine that ate dollars. Maren was restocking a suture cart when she felt it before she saw it. A wrongness in the sound of the room. A man in the third row had stopped shifting in his seat. He had come in an hour ago complaining of heartburn, been triaged as low priority, and been told to wait. He was 56 heavy-set gray at the temples, and he had gone quiet in a way that the rest of the room had not noticed, because quiet is what a waiting room is for, Maren noticed. She set down the suture cart and crossed the floor without hurrying, because hurrying costs time you spend explaining yourself, and she crouched in front of him. "Sir," she said. "Look at me." His skin was the color of wet paper. A sheen of sweat sat on his upper lip, though the room was cold. His breathing had gone shallow and fast, and when she pressed 2 cold fingers to his wrist, his pulse fluttered under them like a bird against glass, quick and thready and about to fail. His left arm rested in his lap in a way he was trying to make look casual, and could not. "This is not heartburn," she said. More to herself than to him. She turned her head toward the desk and pitched her voice to Carrie without rising. "I need a stretcher and a monitor here now. Active chest pain, diaphoretic pulse, thready. Somebody pull a 12 lid and page cardiology." A clerk stared. A resident poked his head out of the curtain and started to say that Fast Track did not take cardiac, that there was a process, and Maren was already moving the man out of the chair with an arm behind his back, taking his weight the way you take the weight of someone who is heavier than you. And does not matter, because right now, nothing mattered except the gray in his face. "Not today," she told him quietly. "You are not doing this today." They got him onto a stretcher. The monitor came up ugly, the rhythm climbing toward the kind of trouble that kills a man in a waiting room chair, while 40 people scroll their phones. Maren had oxygen on him before the resident finished reading the strip. She had the crash cart at the foot of the bed before anyone called for it. She did not shout. She named what she saw once in the right order, and the people around her found that their hands were already doing the things she said, because her voice left no room for a second opinion. The cardiology fellow arrived at a run and took over, and it was his name that would go in the chart, and that was fine. The man was breathing. His color was crawling back from paper toward something human. His wife burst through the waiting room doors a few minutes later, called by a clerk, and when she understood that her husband had nearly died in a plastic chair while she parked the car, she turned to thank whoever had caught it. Maren was already gone. She had stepped back the instant the fellow took the airway, peeled off her gloves, and walked to the sink at the far wall to wash her hands, her back to the whole grateful scene. She did not want to be thanked. Thanks was a spotlight, and she had spent a long time learning to stand outside of one. From the doorway of the far bay, Dutch Halloway watched her wash her hands. He had wheeled himself to the threshold, against every rule on his chart, one hand on the IV pole, and he had seen the whole thing from across the department. He had seen her cross a room she had no reason to be crossing. He had seen her read a dying man from 12 feet away through a crowd. He had seen the way she went cold and quiet and certain, while everyone around her went loud and slow. He had spent 30 years pulling boys off decks and out of surf, and he knew that stillness. He had worn it himself. When Maren turned from the sink, he was looking straight at her, and as she reached up to clip her badge back onto her collar, the ID holder flipped over in her hand and caught the light. Behind the plastic, tucked where a photo might go, was a coin. Round, dull brass, worn nearly smooth and eagle you could barely make out, and letters you could not read at all. It showed for half a second before she pressed it flat against her chest and clipped it down. Dutch saw it. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion and recognition. "That is a unit coin," he said when she came to check his rhythm, because it was easier than not coming. "You carry it where you can touch it without anybody seeing." He let that sit. "Circulation, my foot. Your hands are cold because you learned to be cold. There is a difference, and I know the difference because I ran cold too for 40 years, every time it counted." Maren wrote his heart rate on the flow sheet. "You should be in bed, Mr. Halloway." "Dutch," he said again, patient and stubborn. "And I watched you save a man just now, without letting a soul thank you for it. You know why people do that. Because being seen is more dangerous to them than the thing they just walked into. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'm not asking as a patient. What was your rate?" The word landed somewhere under her ribs. Rate. Rating. A Navy word, an old one, the word for what you were and what you did. Nobody civilian said it like that. Nobody said it like that, unless they had earned the right. Maren capped her pen. The cold in her chest, the one that had started when the radio went quiet before dawn, spread out along her arms and settled into her hands, and for one long moment, she was not standing in the fluorescent light of Cedar Vale General at all. She was somewhere dark and moving, somewhere the water came in cold enough to stop a heart, and a man was bleeding under her hands in the dark and calling her a name that was not Maren. "I was nobody," she said. "Get some rest." She walked out before he could answer, and the memory came with her, rising the way cold water rises in a flooding compartment, faster than you think, higher than you planned, closing over the top of everything. The break room at Cedar Vale had a couch the color of old mustard, and a window that looked out on the ambulance bay. And at 5 in the morning, it belonged to whoever was too tired to pretend they were not. Maren sat on the edge of the couch, with a paper cup of coffee going cold in her cold hands, and didn't drink it. She had learned a long time ago that the body will run on almost nothing if you ask it politely, and do not lie to it about when the rest is coming. She let the memory finish because fighting it took more out of her than letting it pass. It was the water she remembered first. It was always the water. Not warm surf, not a pool, but the black cold of open ocean at night, in a season when a body has minutes and not much more. The bird had gone down the way birds go down all at once, and sideways, and the sound had come apart into the sound of metal, and then the sound of nothing. And then she had been in the water with a strobe she could not find, and 40 pounds of gear trying to teach her the difference between down and forever. Somewhere off her right shoulder, a man was screaming into the swell, and she had swum toward the screaming, because the screaming meant a lung still working. His name was Fontaine. There was a wound low on his left side, pumping dark into darker, and she had gotten a hand into it and a knee under his back, and had held his airway open in a rising sea, by feel alone, because there was nothing to see. There was only touch, and she had talked to him the whole time, in a voice that did not shake, even though everything else did. "Stay. Not tonight. You do not get to do this tonight." She had tied a tourniquet by memory, doubled it, torqued the windlass twice, because once was for people who had time. When the second bird came out of the dark and put a light on the water and a line in her hand, she had clipped Fontaine on before she clipped herself, and a man overhead had shouted a name down through the rotor, wash one syllable the name she had answered to for 11 years. Sable. She had turned her head toward it, and a piece of the aircraft that was still coming apart had found her, opened her along the ribs, and taken the fine hearing out of her left ear, and she had not felt either one until she was on the deck of the second bird, with Fontaine breathing under her hands and the water dropping away below them like a thing that had wanted them and lost. That was the last night she had been Sable in a way that counted. The file went sealed. The ceremony happened in a room with no windows, and never officially happened at all. And a woman named Marin Vance, who had a nursing license that was clean, and a background check that stopped at a wall of gray, took a night contract in a city where nobody knew her, and started counting supply trays for men who thought she was too ordinary to matter. She had chosen it. That was the part Dutch had put his finger on, and the part she did not like to look at directly. She had not been forced into invisibility. She had walked into it and pulled the door shut behind her, because being seen meant being asked, and being asked meant remembering, and remembering meant the water. It was easier to be furniture. Furniture did not get called by its old name at 5 in the morning by a retired corpsman who ran cold, too. Marin set the coffee down without drinking it and pressed 2 fingers against the plastic of her badge over the coin, the way another person might touch a scar. The eagle was worn nearly to nothing. She had rubbed it smooth herself, 1 thumb at a time, across a lot of years, and a lot of rooms she could not talk about. She did not need to see it. She knew every worn place on it, the way she knew the seam of the scar along her ribs and the particular silence on her left side. Theo stuck his head in the door. "You disappeared," he said. "I am allowed a break. You never take a break." He came in and dropped onto the arm of the couch, unwrapping gum he did not need. That guy in the waiting room. The heart. Everybody is saying a nurse caught it from across the room before he even coded. He looked at her sideways. "That was you." "The fellow caught it," she said. Theo made a face. "Sure." He chewed. "You know what your problem is. You are so busy making sure nobody sees you win that you let people like Coyle write the story. One day the story is going to be that you are the one who counts spreaders and gets nervous around trauma, and it is going to be the only story anybody remembers because you never stand still long enough for the true one." She looked at him, then this kind, loud kid who saw more than she wanted him to. "It is a quieter life," she said, "being nobody." "Quieter is not the same as better," Theo said. "My grandmother used to say that. She said the quietest room in the house is usually the one with something locked in it." The words went in deeper than he could have known, and Marin stood up so he would not see it. She rinsed the untouched coffee down the break room sink and watched it go, and while the water ran, she turned her right ear toward the window without deciding to the way she had all night, and out in the ambulance bay under the sodium lights, she saw a county emergency vehicle idle past that did not belong to any service Cedar Vale used. It rolled slow. It did not stop. It circled the bay once its markings a shade off its plate mudded over, and then it slid back out into the dark before the security camera on the corner could get a clean angle on it. Nobody else saw it. Marin watched the empty spot where it had been for a long moment after it was gone. "Something is coming," she said so quietly that Theo asked her to repeat it. "Nothing," she said. "Go check your bays." But the cold in her chest had stopped being a memory. It had become a warning, and she had trusted that particular cold with her life more times than she could count, and it had never once been wrong. At 6:40 in the morning, the phone started, and Maren was the only one who understood what she was hearing before anyone said it out loud. It began small. The charge desk got a call from the county coordinator that Yolanda took standing up, and Maren watched the older woman go still with the receiver against her ear, watched her write nothing down because there was nothing yet, to write only a warning to stand by. A second call came 2 minutes later, this one bumping the first, and the words mass casualty had not been said, but the shape of them was already in the room, the way weather is in a room before the first drop hits the glass. Maren set down the tray she was holding and began quietly to move. She started clearing fast track before anyone gave the order. She walked the sprains and the sore throats to the far waiting area herself, calm, unhurried, telling each one that the department needed the space and thanking them for their patience, and she did it so smoothly that half of them thought it was routine. She had the janitor pull the wax machine out of the center corridor. She had Theo start wheeling every crash cart in the building toward the center line, and when he asked why, she said, "Because in 20 minutes, we are not going to have time to look for them," and he stopped chewing his gum and went. Coyle caught up with her by the medroom. "What are you doing?" he said. "Who authorized moving patients?" "Listen," Maren said. "To what?" "To the room," she said. And for 1 second, because he was not a stupid man, only an arrogant one, Coyle actually listened, and he heard it. The extra phones, the change in Yolanda's voice, the particular tightening that comes into a department when the people who run it start to suspect the floor is about to open under them. The county advisory is a drill, he said, but he said it without conviction. They run these. It is always 4 ambulances and a lot of noise. The radio chose that moment to make him wrong. Cedar Vale Command, the consul said, and it was not the county dispatcher. It was the flat, cold voice from before dawn back, and no longer bothering to disguise itself. Cedar Vale Command, stand by for mass casualty notification. Military personnel. Prepare all trauma capacity. Security escort inbound. The department stopped. Kessler came out of the elevator in his slate suit, with his hair already combed for cameras that had not arrived yet, and he demanded to know what was happening. And Yolanda told him, mass casualty, military. And Kessler said the same thing. Coyle had said that these were always overblown, that unknown meant 5, maybe 6, that the military exaggerated everything. And the radio, which did not care what Warren Kessler believed, came back and put a number in the air that changed the shape of the morning. Cedar Vale confirmed capacity. 87 casualties inbound. Blast trauma. Penetrating wounds. Burns. Airway compromise. First wave, 4 minutes out. Nobody moved. 87. Theo's hand froze halfway to his mouth. A resident said the number out loud, like saying it might make it smaller. Yolanda whispered that it could not be right, and the radio patient and terrible repeated itself. 87 wounded. 4 minutes. Kessler's face went the color of the wall. Coyle turned toward the trauma bays and saw the way Maren had seen 20 minutes ago, that there were not enough of them, not by a factor of 10. And Maren Vance stepped into the center of the frozen room and became someone none of them had ever met. Clear bays 3 through 12, she said, and her voice had changed. It was not loud. It carried on shape instead of volume, the flat command cadence of a person who had run a floor with the ceiling coming down. Ambulatory patients to the east waiting area now. Convert both procedure rooms to treatment. Every crash cart to center line. Theo has them moving, help him finish. Open surgical overflow supply, all of it. Do not wait for a signature. Nobody moved at first. Then Yolanda moved, because 26 years had taught her to recognize the one voice in a crisis that actually knew where the exits were. And when Yolanda moved, the floor moved with her. Maren kept going. Call the blood bank, she said. Massive transfusion protocol activated. Now tell them not to send units. Send coolers. O negative, first we type later. Wake the OR, every room, every anesthesiologist on the call tree. Respiratory, every ventilator in the building, portable suction warmers. Page every surgeon who lives inside 20 minutes and tell them if they argue, they can argue over the bodies, Ms. Vance Kessler said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. You do not give operational orders in my hospital. Marin turned and looked at him fully for the first time since he had humiliated her at 4 a.m. Her gray eyes had gone flat and clear water with no bottom. Then give them yourself, she said. Kessler opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Outside, faint and then not faint, the sirens began. Not one, not four, a wall of them rising out of the city like a tide coming up concrete, and under the sirens, lower the heavy chop of rotors. Marin was already turning back to the floor. Yolanda, she said, split the staff. Red, yellow, green, black. Red gets airway, breathing, bleeding. Yellow stable, but waiting. Green walks. Black is unsalvageable comfort only, and you put one nurse with courage on it, and you do not pull hands off the living to work the dead. Yolanda's face had gone pale. That is battlefield triage, she said. Marin, how do you know how to do this? The bay doors at the end of the department began to open, and cold air rolled in off the ambulance ramp, and the first truck came in too fast, with its tires screaming. Later, Marin said, and she pulled her trauma shears from her pocket, and she walked toward the doors. The first man through the doors was still trying to give orders when they wheeled him in, and that was how Marin knew before she saw a single wound exactly what had arrived at Cedarvale General. He was strapped to a gurney with a chest that was not moving, right dust gray from collar to boots, dark blood-soaked black down his left side, and he was gripping the arm of the medic, pushing him, and rasping numbers, a head count, checking his people even as his own lung tried to quit on him. Behind him came the rest of the first wave, and the men pushing the gurneys did not move like ambulance crews. They moved in tight spacing, with their eyes going to the doorways and the windows and the roofline out of a habit no civilian ever learns. Some of them were bleeding and would not sit. Some of them carried teammates and would not let go. Marin saw the way they filed their pain away behind their eyes until the mission was done. And something in her chest that had been cold for 6 years recognized its own kind and went colder, still all the way down to a place that did not shake. Navy, Special Operations. She knew it in her body before her mind agreed. She caught the first man's wrist as the gurney passed and felt for a radial pulse and barely found one. She looked at his neck, at the veins standing up wrong, at the way his windpipe had shifted a hair off-center, at a chest that rose on one side and not the other. The medic pushing him was already talking. Needle decompression attempted left side, no improvement pressure dropping, and Marin was already shaking her head. Wrong side, she said. This is a tension on the right. You decompressed a chest that did not need it. Coyle was there, of course, drawn to the loudest patient. You cannot call that in 3 seconds, he snapped. Marin had already torn open a 14-gauge catheter. Second intercostal, space mid-clavicular line. Right side, she said, finding the landmark with 2 cold fingers, and she drove the needle home clean, and there was a hiss, a long, thin hiss of trapped air escaping a chest that had been slowly crushing a man's heart, and the gurney seemed to relax under him as his own body remembered how to work. His numbers climbed. 79, 85, 90. The medic stared at her hands. Coyle stared at her face. He still needs a chest tube, Marin said, and she was already at the next gurney. After that, The department came apart into a kind of ordered violence that Cedar Vale had never seen and would talk about for the rest of its existence. Marin moved through it the way she had once moved through worse, and she did not run unless running bought time, and did not raise her voice unless volume saved a life. Her hands did not search. They arrived. A clamp was in her palm before anyone called for one. A chest seal went onto a sucking wound before the resident beside her had finished identifying it. She packed a bleeding thigh with a brutal exact pressure that made the man on the table groan through his teeth, and she leaned close to his ear and told him to stay with her. And he grabbed her wrist with a bloody hand and asked her how many of his people, and she told him the truth, too many to count, yet all alive until I say otherwise. His eyes sharpened at that. That was not a civilian answer, and he knew it, and he was too far gone to chase it. She built a triage board out of a rolling whiteboard, a roll of tape, and a marker that skipped, and she wrote 87 lines of temporary identifiers and colors and blood types and airway status, and it was ugly, and it was perfect, and the department began without anyone deciding it to orbit around it, around her. Nurses who had watched Kessler humiliate her at 4 a.m. were shouting her name by 7. "Vance, this one is crashing. Vance, where does he go? Vance, I need you." And Marin answered all of it. Red to trauma, yellow to procedure, green to the East Hall, black to the family room with comfort, and a nurse who could hold a dying stranger's hand. And she moved through 87 of the most dangerous men. The country grew, as though she had been born inside exactly this kind of ruin. Kessler stood by the nurse's station with a phone against his ear, telling someone that the hospital was fully prepared, that he had the situation in hand, while behind him, a resident vomited into a bin, and the blood bank called up to say the coolers were on the way. He was not in charge, and he knew it, and the knowing was doing something to his face. Then, for a moment, the floor caught its breath, the way even the worst floors do a lull of 30 seconds, while one wave finished, and the next had not yet crested. And in that lull, a young seal with gray eyes and a bandaged forearm caught Marin by the sleeve as she passed. He was maybe 25 and holding himself together by will alone. "My brother," he said. "He came in second truck, took the blast on his right side. I lost him in here." "Please." Marin stopped. She had 87 people bleeding, and she stopped because sometimes 10 seconds is what keeps a man from breaking, and a broken man is one more casualty. She did not check the board. She had already memorized it, every face and wound and color, the way she had once memorized a room by the light. "Beard," she said. "Scar through the left eyebrow. Angry. Swearing at my nurse. The kid's face folded. Yeah, that is him. Yellow zone conscious, furious, cursing everyone who touches him," she said. "That is a good sign. The angry ones are the ones I am not worried about." The young man pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes and breathed, and Marin was already moving again, and she did not see the way he watched her go, or the way the word he had been about to use for her ma'am died on his lips and turned into something else. A question because no charge nurse he had ever met read a trauma floor like a map she had drawn herself. And in the middle of all of it came the moment the whole department would remember, the moment that hung in the air like a held breath. A federal officer had arrived, a woman in a dark jacket, with short gray hair and a badge she had not yet needed to show, and she stood at the edge of the chaos, taking the measure of it, and her eyes kept going back to the one person the room had organized itself around. She watched Marin call attention pneumothorax in 3 seconds. She watched her run a mass casualty triage board with battlefield colors. She watched a bright blue scrub nurse hand orders to trauma surgeons who were smart enough to take them. And the officer said to no one to herself the question that everyone in the room had started to feel and nobody had dared to shape. Who is she? Nobody answered, because nobody at Cedar Vale General knew. They knew Maren Vance, the night contract, the one who counted spreaders, the one Kessler kept in fast track. They did not know the woman standing in the center of the floor with cold, steady hands and 87 lives arranged in her head. They did not know her at all, and Maren, packing a wound that would not stop, felt the officer's eyes on her and felt the old door in her chest, the one she had pulled shut 6 years ago and leaned against, ever since begin to swing open 1 slow inch, and she thought with the part of her that was still trying to be nobody, please not here, not now. Then a monitor across the room began to scream a flat and final tone, and a nurse shouted her name, and there was no more time to be nobody at all. The screaming monitor belonged to a huge bearded man in trauma, 3 mid-40s, a crushed jaw and a neck swelling shut in front of everyone, and a resident was trying to pass a tube down an airway that was closing faster than he could work. I cannot see the cords, the resident said, his voice climbing. I cannot see anything, there is too much blood, I cannot. Maren was already gloving. Move, she said. I almost had it. You had it 90 seconds ago. Move. The man's oxygen was at 72, and dropping, his lips gone the color of a bruise, his hands beginning to claw weakly at the sheet, and Maren put 2 cold fingers against the front of his throat and found the notch and the small, soft window below it, through blood and swollen tissue, and she went very still in the way she got still, only when a life had narrowed down to 1 door. I need a scalpel, she said. A bougie and a 6-0 tube. Coyle came around the curtain and saw what she was reaching for, and his face went white. You are not doing a surgical airway in my department, he said. Absolutely not. That is a physician procedure. You are a nurse. You are not qualified to. And the man's saturation hit 68, and the alarm changed pitch, and Maren held out her open hand into the space between them. Scalpel, she said. Nobody moved. Coyle drew a breath to call security, and a SEAL medic who had been standing against the wall with a field dressing on his own arm stepped forward, pulled a sterile blade from the open tray, and slapped it into Maren's palm. Do it, he said. Maren cut. A horizontal incision, short and controlled, 1 finger, sweeping the tissue apart, the bougie sliding home, the tube following it, the bag connecting, and she squeezed, and the man's chest rose, and the numbers turned around and started to climb, 70, 78, 86, 93. And the alarm went quiet, and the only sound in that corner of the department was the soft, rhythmic push of the bag moving air into a chest that had been about to stop forever. The SEAL medic stared at her hands, then at her face, and his expression was not gratitude. It was something closer to suspicion, braided into respect. No nurse cuts a neck that clean, he said quietly. Not that fast, not without shaking. He looked at the length of black webbing looped through her belt, doubled, and torqued off in a way he knew, and his eyes narrowed. Where did you learn that? Patience teaches fast, Maren said, and she stripped off the bloody gloves and moved on, and he did not believe her, and belief was not required. Breathing was. That was when it started to go wrong in the other direction. A late ambulance rolled up the ramp, and 2 EMS crew came through the doors with a gurney, and Maren clocked the second one the way she clocked everything without deciding to from 30 feet away and half a room deep. He was dressed right. His patch said the right service. His boots were the right boots. And everything about the way he moved was wrong. He held the gurney rail like a man who had been told what a gurney was, but had never pushed a dying person on one. His trauma bag hung off the wrong shoulder for a right-handed medic. His eyes did not go to his patient, not once they went to the yellow zone, to the row of wounded SEALs laid out, and helpless, and they stayed there, counting the way a man counts a thing he has come to finish. Real medics look at their patient. This one was looking at his targets. Maren did not shout. Shouting would have moved him. She stepped sideways, unhurried, putting herself between the imposter and the yellow zone, and she caught the federal officer's eye across the floor and held it, and moved her chin one small degree toward the man at the doors. The officer who had spent the last hour learning to read Maren Vance followed the line of it and went still. The imposter set his gurney against the wall and reached into his trauma bag, and his hand did not come out with gauze. Maren was already moving. She crossed the space at a walk that ate ground faster than a run because it did not warn him, and she said one word, low and flat and pitched, to reach only him the word she had used in a different life, to freeze a man in place before he could make the worst decision of his last few seconds. "Sable Actual," she said. "Stand down." It should have meant nothing to him. It was not for him. It was a bluff built out of muscle memory, and it worked exactly the way she needed it to, because for 1/2 second, the man's eyes flicked to her startled, trying to place a phrase that sounded like authority, and in that 1/2 second, his hand hesitated inside the bag, and 1/2 second was all Maren Vance had ever needed. She was on him. She trapped the arm against his body, took him off his base, and put him on the floor with a control that had nothing to do with anger. A chest seal in her other hand pressed flat and pointless against his shoulder, as if she were rendering aid, and the federal officer and 2 of the SEALs, who could still stand, were on him a breath later, and whatever had been in the bag never came out of it. The department froze, and into that silence from a chair in the yellow zone, a battered voice said her name, her real one. Sable. Maren looked up from the man on the floor. Senior Chief Eli Fontaine was sitting up against every instruction, a dressing taped over his ribs, gray and shaking, and staring at her, like a man seeing weather he thought had passed forever. She had held his airway in a black ocean 6 years ago. She had tied a tourniquet by feel and torqued it twice and clipped him to a line before she clipped herself. He had shouted a name up through a rotor, and she had turned toward it and lost part of her hearing to it. And he knew that loop of webbing on her belt, and he knew those cold, steady hands, and he knew her. "Sable," he said again, and it went through the yellow zone like a spark down a wet line. Heads came up. Men with bandaged faces and blood-soaked uniforms turned toward her, and the young one with the gray eyes, whose brother she had found, and the medic who had put the scalpel in her hand, and one of them said it to the next, and the next repeated it low, certain not a chant, a recognition. "Sable, that is Sable." Kessler pushed up off the wall he had been holding. What he said, his voice cracking. "What does that mean? Who is she?" The federal officer rose slowly from the man she had just helped pin, and she looked at Maren with the last of her question burning off into certainty, and she pulled out a badge that read, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and did not offer to shake hands because she had learned in the last hour that this woman didn't take offered hands. And Dutch Halloway, who had wheeled himself all the way to the edge of the trauma floor against every rule in the building because he was not going to miss this, looked at the room full of men saluting a night nurse with their eyes, and he smiled a slow, satisfied smile, and said to no one, and to everyone, cold hands, warm work. I told you. I knew a corpsman when I saw one. Maren Vance stood up in the center of a department that had spent 2 years deciding she was too ordinary to matter, and the cold in her chest was not a memory anymore, and not a warning anymore. It was just her. All of her, the whole locked room thrown open at once, and 87 wounded SEALs, and a corrupt director, and an arrogant surgeon, and a federal agent, were all finally looking at exactly who she was. I need this man in restraints, and I need federal custody at both doors, she said into the silence. And then I need to get back to work, because I still have people bleeding, and none of them have died yet, and I intend to keep it that way. They kept it that way. That was the thing that mattered in the end more than any name. By late afternoon, Cedar Vale General looked like a building that had survived a war because it had. Blood had dried into the grout of the trauma floor, no matter how many times they mopped it. Federal agents stood at every entrance. SEALs who could walk refused to leave the ones who could not, and the ones who could not kept asking the same question every time Marin passed: how many made it? And Marin refused to lie to them, so she gave them the only honest answer there was. So far, all 87. So far was a word they understood better than anyone alive, and it was enough. The man who had come through the doors dressed as a medic was in federal custody within the hour, and he did not stay silent long. Special Agent Diane Halloran of NCIS sat across a table from him, and then came looking for Marin, and she found her in a supply closet, where Marin had allowed herself exactly 40 seconds, sitting on an overturned bucket, with her elbows on her knees, and her cold hands pressed together, breathing through a tremor she had held off for 11 hours and could finally afford. Halloran had the decency to knock. "You were right about the vehicle before dawn," Halloran said. "And you were right about him. He was not the start of it. He was the cleanup. The blast that did this was meant to finish these men before they could testify in a sealed proceeding, and when the blast left survivors, someone needed a place to send those survivors, where the finishing could be quiet." She paused. "That someone made sure this hospital was not ready." Marin looked up. "The finishing needed a bottleneck," she said. "Minimal staff. No overflow supply open. Surgical reserve held back on a technicality. A director, too, worried about optics to prepare." Halloran's face did not move. "We received notice of an inbound mass casualty 2 hours before the first truck arrived," she said. "Your director received the same notice. He activated nothing. He told his charge nurse to keep the circle tight because a contact he trusted told him to. That contact does not exist in any command Cedar Vale answers to. He was sold routing information, and he bought it because being told a secret made him feel important. They found Warren Kessler in his office with the door open and 2 federal officers already standing outside it. He had loosened his tie. His hair had fallen out of its careful line. He looked like a man watching his own statue come apart from the base up. And when Marin appeared in the doorway, he said her first name, Marin, in a voice trying for intimacy it had never earned. "You will want to know, I did not understand what I was part of," he said. "You did not ask," Marin said. Those 3 words landed harder than any accusation. "You had 2 hours. You had 87 wounded service members inbound, and a warning in your hand, and you spent it protecting how the department would look instead of whether it would work. You humiliated me at 4 in the morning because you decided quiet meant weak. You put me in fast track because you decided I was nobody. And it very nearly killed all of them, and it would have if the room had waited for you to be brave." Kessler had nothing. The arrogance had drained out of him and left a smaller man who had mistaken control for competence his whole life. And the officers took him out through the lobby, and that was where the last thing happened, the thing none of them would forget. The lobby was full against every instruction staff and patients and the SEALs who could stand. And as the officers walked Warren Kessler toward the doors, with his badge hanging useless from his own hand, the wounded began to rise. Not all at once. Some of them leaned on crutches. Some pushed up on IV poles. Some were wrapped so heavily they could barely straighten. But one by one across the whole lobby, 87 men, or the ones who could, came to their feet, not for the director being let out, but for the nurse standing quietly at the edge of it all. Nobody applauded. That was what made it strong. The room simply stood in silence, and Warren Kessler had to walk out through the middle of 100 people rising for the woman he had called nobody. And Justice did not need to say a word. Dr. Voss, who had held a surgical reserve on a billing technicality that morning, until Marin went over his head and made him move, found her afterward in the hallway outside recovery. He did not apologize with words first. He said, "Chief Nolan, the abdominal bleed, he made it. We repaired the spleen and the liver, another 10 minutes, and we would have lost him." Then he looked at the floor. "I let administration reach into a medical decision. I will not do it again." And Marin, who had learned that apologies were easy after everyone survived, asked him the only question that meant anything. "What will you do differently tomorrow?" Voss understood. "I will say no on the record to anyone who tries it," he said, and she nodded once and told him to start by giving his statement to Halloran, and he did. In the weeks that followed the sealed proceeding, those men had been meant to die before Reaching went forward, and it went forward, because all 87 of them lived to be part of it. Kessler resigned before the board could remove him, and then answered to a federal charge that no resignation could outrun. The false contact who had sold the routing was arrested under a name that was not his. And Cedar Vale General built something new out of the wreckage of that day, an emergency response protocol with a verification chain, mass casualty drills, surgical override rules, and one line printed in plain language at the top of the first page. No administrator may delay emergency care for financial review. Ever. They offered Marin the directorship of it. She turned it down. She was a nurse, she said, and she wanted to stay one. So they made her clinical lead and left her on the floor, still in bright blue scrubs, still running cold, still the one the room turned toward. And now when Marin Vance spoke, the hospital moved. Dutch Halloway went home with a pacemaker and a story he was not allowed to tell most of. And before he left, he took her cold hand in both of his and said, "I knew. First time you took my pulse. Cold hands, warm work. You do not have to hide from us the ones who ran cold, too. We are the only ones who ever really saw you anyway." Marin did not have an answer for that, so she squeezed his hand, which was answer enough for an old corpsman. Senior Chief Eli Fontaine found her the day he transferred out. He did not say much. Men like Fontaine never did. He just looked at her for a long moment and said, "You clipped me on before you clipped yourself. Both times. In the water and in here." And then he touched 2 fingers to his brow, and she returned it, and neither of them needed the rest of the words. Months later, they put a plaque near the ambulance bay, and Marin fought it until the new administrator agreed to her one condition. Her name would not stand alone. So the plaque read, "For the 87 lives held here, and for every worker who chose courage over silence," and below it were the names of the nurses and the techs and the surgeons and the security guards and the dispatchers who had moved when the room needed moving, and Marin Vance's name sat in the middle of them exactly where she wanted it, no larger than the rest. Late one night when the department was quiet, Theo leaned out of the doors and called down the hall, "Vance, incoming. Chest trauma 3 minutes out." And the quiet nurse pulled on her gloves, the blue cuff snapping against her cold wrists, and the team was already moving around her without waiting to be told, and without asking whether she knew what she was doing, because they knew, and the doors opened, and another life crossed the threshold. Into a room that had finally learned to stand up first. Marin Vance spent years believing that hiding was the same as healing. It was not. Hiding had kept her alive. Being seen and staying anyway was the thing that finally let her live. Whatever you have survived, whatever name you answered to before the one you carry now, it did not make you less. It is the reason you are still standing, and the world needs the quiet ones who see what everyone else misses and step forward when everyone else freezes. If this story reached something in you, tonight tap, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, so the next story finds you. Then tell me in the comments, if you had been in that room at 4 a.m. treated like you were, nobody would you have stood up. I think you would have.